Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. Hopefully all of you can see my screen and audio is coming through clear. We've got a few more people trickling in, but we will make a start since we're on time now. So yeah, welcome and thank you for joining. Here now we are going to be talking through our Endpoint Security Showdown presentation. The subject or the subtitle of this is Best of Suite versus Best of Breed, and we'll be finding out a bit more about that as we go through the concepts of today. So my name is Luke Elston. I'm the Microsoft Principal Consultant here at CyberOne. So I am one of the leads here in our business, focusing primarily on everything Microsoft security related. With me, I've got Nick. So Nick, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi guys. So Nick Wren, I'm head of pre-sales at CyberOne. Also a primary focus on some of our products, and one of which being SentinelOne.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. So 2 speakers for the price of 1 today. So that's usually a good recipe. So without further ado, we will continue. I just want to introduce, for those that don't know us, I know we do have some of our existing customers on the call, so I can see a few familiar faces there, so welcome. But for those who don't know us, CyberOne, we've been around for a fair while now, so since 2005, we've focused on a couple of different industries, security being obviously the preeminent one. We're a privately owned business, so there's no shareholders to boss us around. We do things in the way that we see fit, which is always good in terms of being dynamic and flexible and making sure we're keeping up with industry trends, which is, of course, very important in the cyber world. Down at the bottom, you can see a few of our credentials. So just to call out a couple, one that we're particularly proud of is our Cyber Incident Response Level 2 with the NCSC. That's quite a rare badge. There isn't many service providers like ourselves in the UK with that particular one, so we're quite proud of that. And also quite relevant to today, we are a Microsoft security partner, and we have a couple of their specialisms in the Microsoft partner world as well. So without over-egging it, that is CyberOne really. Again, just a brief overview here. We are ultimately a managed security services provider. You can see on screen kind of our core portfolio. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but the idea is that we can do pretty much anything in the cyberspace. You know, some of our bread and butter is providing managed detection and response services through our award-winning SOC. And we also do lots of work around assessment and vulnerability management and identity and securing of zero trust principles. So some of that we may touch on ever so slightly today, but of course today's focus is on endpoint security. So that will be our main talking point. So with the required preamble out of the way, we're going to introduce the actual session. So what I wanted to talk through is, why we're even hosting this in the first place. Why is this topic important? Well, it's quite important because of recent events. If we remember not too long ago, CrowdStrike had a bit of a disaster, and that did have a pretty global effect if we're being realistic. The interesting part of that is, of course, is that Microsoft sort of got caught in the crosshairs a little bit because the bug introduced by CrowdStrike affected Windows devices. Obviously, the media initially blamed Microsoft, but it was later clarified that it wasn't really a Microsoft problem. It was a CrowdStrike issue. There is other events that are similar in profile and very relevant to endpoint security. So SolarWinds, if we can remember that far back, it seems like yesterday actually, but SolarWinds, that was a big one. Quite a significant compromise there. Again, another well-known name in the industry being the target and victim. And then Move IT, it may not be something that people immediately remember, but that was a major breach in the US where a lot of social security numbers, some several million, were exposed, and that caused a lot of media in the US. We heard a little bit about it here, but again, these things are important because endpoint security was a factor in all 3 of these instances, and that is one of the drivers for us hosting this session today. Beyond that, we've got the typical ever-evolving security landscape, so it never stays still. We're constantly playing cat and mouse with the bad guys. Unfortunately, they have first movers advantage, so whenever a bad guy creates a new piece of malware, a new piece of ransomware, or comes up with a new attack technique, it is the defenders, the good guys like ourselves, who have to play catch up with that. For that reason, it is very important that key assets such as endpoints are well protected with a modern EDR solution. We're going to be talking about two particular solutions today and kind of contrasting and comparing them. But of course, any EDR product worth its salt should be able to help at least mitigate some of the more modern threats that we see. And then finally, I mentioned it in the very beginning of the session, but best of suite versus best of breed. It's quite an interesting topic. And the idea is we're going to kind of bounce off, myself and Nick are going to bounce off between each other to discuss some of the pros and cons of that concept as we go through today's presentation. So just in case we aren't clear, and I'm sure we all are, what is endpoint security? Well, endpoint security really is just around protecting laptops, computers, servers, phones, tablets, IoT devices, or other bits of hardware from cyber attack. So fairly straightforward stuff. You know, I would expect that a modern EDR product can cover pretty much any sort of standard piece of hardware, whether that's a user's laptop, a BYOD device, or a mobile phone. All of those things should be covered, at least to some extent, by a modern product. And just a brief history lesson. So what is EDR? I've mentioned that acronym a couple of times. In case people aren't aware, EDR, you can see at the top of the slide there, is Endpoint Detection Response. It's essentially the natural progression of what was traditional antivirus. So we think back in the day, and you don't even need to go that far back, you know, less than 10 years back. Traditional antivirus is all that we really had. So it would be quite good at detecting known malware. It could pick up on things like Trojans, which was often the buzzword back then. And it did that through signatures. So it knew that these threats existed. It knew how to identify them, and it had a signature-based detection method. And that worked relatively well for the time. But there was no real response capability in traditional antivirus. It very much was just, I'm going to block this threat because I know it's a threat. And it didn't really go much further than that. So in the modern day, a traditional antivirus is just no good because any even semi-complicated attack would be too much for it. So 0 days, fileless malware, or polymorphic malware would all be a bit too much for a traditional AV. And that's why we need to think about endpoint security in terms of EDR. So with EDR, we get real-time threat detection, we get real-time investigation, and real-time response actions, those being the key parts of that EDR acronym. And the idea is that not only can it detect things based on a signature, it has that traditional kind of basic level of anti-checking built in, but it can also respond to unknown threats. So it does this through a number of means. We'll cover some of them today. But the idea is that an EDR product has so much back-end data feeding, usually through AI or machine learning, feeding its detection engine, that it can just pick up on unusual or suspicious or malicious behavior. Even if it doesn't really know what the threat is, it can identify that the behavior itself is potentially a bit risky, and then it can take a blocking action potentially. So that automated response is a key part. You know, a simple example would be that a file ends up on a user's device. That file has never been seen before, so we don't know for a fact that it's malicious, but the EDR product in place picks up on the behavior of that file. It could be that the file is maybe trying to encrypt something. That might indicate that it's ransomware, and the EDR product would hopefully, fingers crossed at least, then detect that that's something that we don't want and then block that file automatically. What you would also expect is that an EDR product, once it's detected that threat on one device, it will apply that level of logic across all your devices and make sure that that threat can't spread. So it would kind of act as a, you know, one machine picks up the threat, but 100 machines are protected from it. These are some of the concepts behind EDR, and all of these things are very important in the modern day. So just to dive into the best of breed versus best of suite argument, these are some of the talking points for best of breed. So best of breed really is, you would typically think of it as the most specialized, most innovative product in its category. So in our case, SentinelOne is the example that we'll be going through today. So it's typically the vendor's sort of crown jewel, their magnum opus. It's the product that they have that is the most well regarded and very typically tailored in what it does. It's very good at one thing, and it does it to a high standard. and it's typically considered, a very strong player in that one area. The best of suite option then, which in today's case is on Microsoft side of the argument, is that it's not just one technology, it's actually a suite of technologies. So within there, we might have endpoint detection and response, an EDR product, but we also have other things in the mix that together would provide a broader set of coverages. And you would also expect that between that suite of products that there's native integration. And the idea is that that would lead to a simplified kind of administrative plane. So those are some of the core ideas. Obviously, as we go through today, we will dive into some of those in more detail. What I should also say is that we will have time for Q&A at the end of the session. So if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat. If we've got time, we may even respond while we're presenting, but no promises on that one. If not, we'll make sure we cover them at the end of the session. Okay, so just to dive into kind of a bit more detail here. So in terms of best of breeds, I've covered a fair few of these already, but another one to call out would be to avoid vendor lock-in. So some organizations will not want to have all their eggs in one basket, in which case a best of suite would not be ideal because typically that best of suite includes everything. So the best of breed may be the better approach. It also may be that your organization has very particular workloads that need to be protected, and a best of breed vendor may be more able to protect those particular workloads. So if you need some kind of niche or specialist level of endpoint protection, then best of breed may be the one to consider. There is obviously the flip side to it, which is that if you go with a best of breed approach for all of your security products, whether it's endpoint protection or email security or identity security or anything else, you've then got multiple tools, and those multiple tools may not play well together, and that can cause administration problems because you need staff skilled in multiple tools. The tools themselves may not naturally share data, which means correlation of information can be a bit difficult. What you'd often find is that with best of breed and more specialist tools, you pay a premium because they're, of course, specialists. They do their job very, very well, and therefore you have a higher individual cost per tool, which could be challenging on the old purse strings. In terms of best of suite, so some pros on that side is that the suite of products in question would inevitably natively integrate with each other. So again, whether it's endpoint, email, or identity-based security, those three things would just naturally share data. They would correlate data across the three product areas. And that means that you don't really need to do any correlation. That's just happening automatically within the suite of products. Another big sort of very key element there, single pane of glass. So again, in best of suite, you would expect sort of one main dashboard, or certainly very few dashboards, and they would present one holistic view of your security tools in one easy to understand way. That itself, that kind of simplified administration can be really important. I would also argue one of the stronger arguments for best of suite is around the total cost of ownership. Ultimately, if you're paying for one license that covers multiple products, then that's more simple than paying for 5 different licenses for 5 different products. And that can typically be cheaper. If not cheaper, then it will certainly be easier to manage the cost of that. Some of the cons there, so vendor lock-in, like I said, all your eggs in one basket may not be appropriate for your organization. And then because you're investing heavily in one vendor, not only do you get that lock-in element, you also are confined to what that vendor believes are good features. So you can only, of course, use the capabilities available in the product you're paying for if that entire suite that you have is missing something that you would otherwise need. Well, you either will have to go without or look at buying a supplementary product from another vendor. So that could be a problem as well. Okay, so just to move on to the actual vendors in question, I did touch on them earlier. So this is a screenshot from 2001 from Gartner's Magic Quadrants, which I'm sure we all recognize. You can see SentinelOne and Microsoft there in the upper right quadrant. So both of them are considered leaders. It means that they have a strong ability to execute and a strong vision. So they're both innovative. They both have a very powerful product that's able to do all the things we need it to do. And they're trend setting, they're developing features within their products that are leading the way in the industry. So both of them doing pretty good in the top right. If you move on to 2002, what's interesting here is the gap has closed. In 2001, Microsoft were a larger, sort of a bigger leader within the quadrant, but in 2002 that gap has shrunk. So SentinelOne have caught up. They've maybe innovated a bit more. They've brought in some new features, that kind of thing. And then if we look at the most recent one, unfortunately there isn't one available for 2004 just yet, but in 2003 the gap is even closer. So Microsoft and SentinelOne, again, both leaders, but that gap between them is even smaller. And interestingly, we can see CrowdStrike there in the upper right-hand corner. It'd be interesting to see how they're scored in this year's quadrant, because obviously we saw that issue with them. It's not to say their product is bad by any means. It's always been a leader as well, but it's obviously had that issue, and whether that will affect its scoring remains to be seen. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly intro the specifics here, and then we'll start comparing the two products. So on the Microsoft side, we've got their EDR technology, which is called Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. That is part of a wider software suite called Defender XDR. And that's kind of what we're talking about when we think of best of suite in today's presentation. On the SentinelOne side, they have an EDR product called Singularity Endpoint. Now, what I will caveat here is that technically speaking, SentinelOne also offer an XDR solution. But the reason that we're focusing on endpoint here is that really SentinelOne are known for their endpoint product. That is their crown jewel. They do have an XDR suite, but it's quite a lot smaller than Microsoft, and it wouldn't really be a fair comparison. So what we're looking at here is, the peak of SentinelOne, their actual endpoint product, versus the Microsoft equivalent, and that gives us a relatively fair playing field. Okay, so without further ado, we'll start to compare the products. Now, although we've titled this as sort of a showdown, we're not saying one product is necessarily better than the other. We work with both of these. We've got people like myself and Nick in the business with specialities in these different tools. I have my preference. I'm biased to Microsoft. Nick has his own biases as well. But the idea is just to present an argument and allow you to make a decision that is suitable for your organization. So our first topic here is on performance. So on the Microsoft side, Defender is built in to modern Windows systems. So with Windows 10 and above and Windows Server 2016 and above, the actual Defender product is built in. That gives you a performance advantage because we're not installing something in addition to the operating system. It actually is within the operating system, and you can imagine there are performance efficiencies there, which are well achieved by Microsoft. Beyond that, there is actually a performance analyzer tool, which is also built into Defender natively. That tool is only for the antivirus component because realistically, that's the part that is easiest to do performance checking on. But that tool's free. It just allows you to kind of test the performance impact, if any, on your workloads, your devices. Another key thing is that the performance is automatically scaling. So this is true for most modern products in general, whether they're security tools or not. But what you'll find is that if the system itself is very overloaded, then Defender will try to scale itself appropriately. So it will try to avoid hogging too many resources on the actual device. And then finally, the minimum requirements are quite small. So 2 cores is the minimum. The recommended is 4. And then we have 1 GB of memory. The recommended is 2, but either way, fairly low performance requirements.
Cool. So in terms of the performance impact on a device on the SentinelOne side, generally we see that the impact is pretty minimal. And this is because of SentinelOne's behavioral AI engine that's monitoring the processes at the kernel level. So CPU utilization is very low, along with the memory consumption. It is worth noting that SentinelOne on first deployment will do a full system scan, and that will likely have some performance impacts like a traditional AV would. Once it is run the first time, though, there's no requirement to do it again, although you still have the option to. But essentially, as a result, SentinelOne can run on a device with as little as 1 gigabyte RAM requirement.
Cheers, Nick. So our next area then on the deployment options themselves. So how are we actually getting these tools onto our devices? So on the Microsoft side, all conventional deployment methods are supported. So whether that's just running a script locally on the machine, whether you're using a more traditional tool like SCCM, whether you're using a modern tool like Intune, you can even use group policy if you wanted to. All these typical ways of deploying essentially a piece of software are supported. So there is no real limitation there. In the Microsoft world, ultimately, regardless of whether you choose Intune or group policy or SCCM or some other deployment tool, what you're actually doing is deploying a script, and that script is simply onboarding the machine. So if we talk about modern Windows devices, we're not really installing anything, we're just onboarding the machine. And all that means is that we're instructing the device to communicate to the Microsoft Cloud. That's for modern Windows devices. For what we would refer to as down-level operating systems, so things like Server 2012 R2, an older system, there is a level of installation that needs to happen, and it varies depending on the OS. But again, it's ultimately about onboarding rather than installing a whole AV and EDR system. There's generally no reboot required, although of course you can, and you should be encouraging reboots regularly anyway, but there isn't a hard requirement for that.
Cool. So on the SentinelOne side, so SentinelOne supports all the usual deployment methods. And again, similar to Microsoft, it won't prompt users for reboot on installation. So once a device is deployed, it will then show in the SentinelOne platform, and it will begin that discovery scan. SentinelOne also prides itself on being super easy to deploy and configure. So even with no configuration changes, SentinelOne can be deployed and work with no misdetections out of the box. And at the time of its inception, it was something that no other EDR tool had done before. So for ease of deployment and integration, SentinelOne can be deployed in a detect-only mode or configure manually, or you can allow the platform to make its automatic decisions using the AI engine.
Okay, brilliant. So again, I think Nick raised an interesting point. An example of innovation there by SentinelOne, they were the first in industry to pioneer that particular feature. So a good argument as to why they're considered a leader for the last few years by Gartner. Next section then is around patching and security intelligence updates. So this is not around deploying the product. We're assuming it's already in place at this point. This is around actually updating the detection capability. So there's two core elements here when we think of the Microsoft ecosystem. So patching, the Defender products, of course, do receive patches and updates that actually change the product's functionality. The way that they work in the Microsoft world is they're deployed as part of Windows updates. They come packaged within the standard updates you would see for Windows. Sometimes they have their own line item. Sometimes they're just within a larger update affecting the whole operating system. So those, you can just think of them as normal updates that you would deal with on your Windows devices anyway. You don't need to do anything special. They will just happen according to your usual patching process. Beyond that, we've got the security intelligence updates. So these are a bit different. This is where the actual detection logic is being updated. Ultimately, because Defender is a cloud native security tool, a lot of the logic is actually hosted in the cloud. Only some of it reaches the device. The bits of the detection logic that do reach the device are pushed down using these security intelligence updates, and we actually get to configure when those occur. So typically, it's every couple of hours. You could scope it to as regularly as 1 hour, I believe, or you could scope it to every 24 hours. In my experience, there is no real performance impact here. And often what you'll see is that some organizations will configure it so when a machine is rebooted, it then checks for the latest security intelligence updates on reboot. And that way, you've always got the latest versions in place. In terms of patching and the intelligence updates, generally they're non-disruptive. Generally, reboots aren't required. Sometimes a patch may require a reboot, but that's again fairly normal. In terms of the intelligence updates, they typically will not require any kind of reboot. It is also worth mentioning that these intelligence updates are very frequent. So as Microsoft discovers new threat intelligence, they detect a new attack. They, of course, update their product. Again, most of that happens in the cloud, but some of it will reach the device through these particular updates.
Cool. So on the patching and security intelligence for SentinelOne, it's again like Microsoft, so built into the platform and lives under the same management portal as the rest of the solution. The patches are automatically deployed, and they also don't require a restart. SentinelOne also has the continuous threat intel updates for the reputation-based detection and file hashing, but is also paired with that behavioral AI engine to monitor the suspicious processes on a machine. Again, like Microsoft, these updates are continual, and there isn't really any performance impact on their frequency. So yeah.
Okay, so a key item now, so data privacy and data security. Of course, with these tools, you are ultimately handing over an awful amount of telemetry in order for them to properly protect your environment. And with that comes the obvious question, what happens to our data? So on the Microsoft side, all of the data that is within your Defender tenant, your actual Microsoft ecosystem, is encrypted, and it cannot be accessed by anyone outside of your tenant, and that includes Microsoft. Now, what I will say is that Microsoft can technically gain visibility to your Defender dashboard, but the only way they do that is actually if you give them permission. So for those of you who maybe have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft, you may have experienced this, but if you raise a support ticket, Microsoft will request access to view your tenant, and you can choose whether to grant it or not. The way that works is that they're viewing it ultimately as one of your users would. So there's no kind of back-end access here. It's very much front-end access. It's almost like giving a guest or maybe even myself access to view your tenant. It's the same kind of logic. It just happens to be a Microsoft support engineer. So there is no backdoor into your sort of telemetry here. The data within Defender then is retained for up to 180 days. There's no extra charge for that. That's just what's included in the product. After that time period, the data available within your tenant is deleted. Now, a key point, and probably one of the most important elements here, is that because we're talking about a cloud-native security tool, Microsoft does take some data to train their product. Now, any data that they do train is anonymized. So things like usernames or device names or IP addresses, or even the domain that the data comes from, those items will not be known to Microsoft. They just know that the raw data that matters for detecting a piece of malware or detecting a phishing attack, that kind of thing. So that information is anonymized and basically sent back to Microsoft's what they call the security intelligent graph, which is kind of the back-end brain behind the Microsoft world. But you don't need to worry, none of your information is being exposed there. One other thing just around the privacy element is that recently, I'm sure some people are aware that Microsoft have now begun to support multi-tenancies across the Defender XDR ecosystem. So in terms of data privacy, if you do have multiple tenancies, you need to consider that the data available in one of those tenants could be viewable through the other tenant. Now, of course, you have to manually set that up. It's not going to happen accidentally, but just something to be aware of on that final point.
Yeah, so of course with SentinelOne, data is encrypted as you would expect. Data is retained for 1 year, although that is subject to the licensing requirements. SentinelOne also has many privacy policies and compliance standards that must be adhered to. But just like Microsoft, SentinelOne also uses that anonymized data to help train its detection engines. SentinelOne could see the data in the same way that Microsoft could if access is given through a support ticket to obviously help the support teams in troubleshooting and things like that. But again, it has to be done, manually by an administrator. So it's not something that's accidentally going to happen, and it's not something that SentinelOne have access to unless granted. SentinelOne supports the use of multi-tenancy, and as far as I'm aware, they always have, just to allow managed service providers, their support teams, and internal support teams to administer multiple sites through that one pane of glass. And again, the same is true. Obviously, you have to be aware of that you'll be able to see the data across those sites, right? But yeah, again, the same as Microsoft, so all's well there.
Okay. So on the user interface side, we'll bring up a few screenshots to better illustrate this in a moment. But on the Microsoft front, as I mentioned earlier, we've got a single pane of glass. So that being one of the key sort of selling points and marketability elements of the product is that all of the alerts and incidents and telemetry is available through one dashboard. And because we're talking about a full XDR, a full suite of products here, a best of suite ecosystem, we get our endpoint information available in that one single pane of glass, but we also get lots of other data available in there as well. We've got the ability to also assign owners to alerts and incidents, and then we can track the actions that those people take. So if somebody, for example, isolates a device and chooses to contain a particular threat, that will be tracked against that alert or incident, and we can see who did it, what date, what time, what action they took, and we get a historical view over the whole investigation cycle for that particular challenge. And then there is some built-in reports in the Microsoft world. There's actually an entire section of their dashboard available on reporting. All of that can be exported into a CSV format. And the idea is it's just visual reports showing you, trends over time and number of devices impacted by a certain threat and those kind of things.
Cool. So there's two focuses on the SentinelOne side. Obviously, one's on the end user perspective, and then in terms of the administrative experience. So from an end user experience perspective, really they should never know that SentinelOne is actually active on a device. This is a main focus for SentinelOne and is reflected in the deployment process with limited to no reboots. And the same goes for the patching. Again, I think this is just to try and combat the fact that Microsoft has it built in already, given it's their OS. I think the playing field becomes a bit more level when you're starting to talk about different operating systems. Users would, only really be aware of SentinelOne's presence on an endpoint in the case of a breach or a device isolation. And then in terms of the administrative experience, so SentinelOne makes the configuration really easy, really simple config requirements and very intuitive administration interface. The SentinelOne platform also has built-in analytics, reporting, and this all comes with contextual help as well inside the administration portal. They also offer a repository of guides for customers and training courses for administrators so they can get up to speed. Although for the most part, as we've seen before, that SentinelOne's core functionality really works out of the box, and it's a big focal point for them.
Yeah, it's probably also worth me mentioning that in terms of the actual end user experience in the Microsoft world, by default, it's very obvious that you're protected by Defender because there's a little icon in your system tray down in the bottom right that has a little shield saying, Defender is active. And also if the user is vaguely tech savvy, they can open the actual Defender sort of part of the control panel. Now, you can restrict that behavior. If you want to, you can use some settings to make it invisible to the end user if you wanted to, but by default, it's very much visible. So it's really down to your organization's preference on whether you let the users know which product is protecting them. So here is just a view of the Microsoft main dashboard, really. Now, there's a lot on here, and I'm not going to talk through all of this, but all I really wanted to present is what it actually looks like. So for those who haven't seen Defender, again, because it's a best of suite, on the left-hand side, that navigation, you can see we've got endpoint identities and email down on the bottom left area. For the purposes of today, we're trying to focus on endpoint, but in the Microsoft world, those things come together. They are a suite of products. So because of that, the dashboard tends to be more noisy. There's more information available on it, but that's because there's multiple data sources coming in. So this just gives you an example of what a typical sort of Defender tenant experience would be like. We'll then just bring up the SentinelOne equivalent. So this is kind of the one example of a dashboard. You can see there that you can actually create your own dashboards in SentinelOne. That's something that Microsoft doesn't really have. There is roundabout ways to do it, but it isn't really a native part of the portal. But with SentinelOne, you could create multiple views. We've just got one here as an example. And of course, that means you can choose exactly what is there and what isn't there, and then keep it as busy or as clutter-free as you would like. So this view now is back to the Microsoft side, and this is just a list of incidents. So fairly straightforward stuff. You can see the name of the incident. These naming, then the actual names are automatically generated by Defender. You can go in and rename them if you want to, but you can then see sort of the high-level information around the incidents that are happening. Now, in this particular example, this was taken from one of our test environments. You can see the sources of information over to the right-hand side are actually around DLP, around Office 365, and around identity. So it just so happens that when I took this screenshot, there were no endpoint-related incidents in our test environment. And that just again illustrates that it's a best of suite product. You can't get away from the fact that there's multiple data sources going in there. And then this is a sort of a SentinelOne equivalent. So in this view, we've dropped down a level. So we're not looking at sort of the all up page, we're looking at a slightly dropped down version. But again, similar kind of information is here. So you can see things like what the detection engine was. So which part of SentinelOne has actually picked up on this particular threat. So you can see some of them are reputational, some of them are behavioral based detections. Microsoft has a similar kind of naming convention, but this again is just to illustrate kind of the styling of the two different portals. So we'll switch over to vulnerability management. On the Microsoft side, we've got a continuous real-time vulnerability management built into Defender. So depending on your licensing, and we'll talk about cost and licensing a bit later, you get different features available to you, but ultimately you get a series of built-in vulnerability capabilities. This can pick up on operating system misconfiguration, application vulnerabilities, and any other weaknesses and exposures present in your environment.
So on the SentinelOne side, SentinelOne also has built-in risk and vulnerability management, and it combines the executive insights with a prioritized list of vulnerable applications and OSs for the IT teams to be able to execute their patch management programs. It is probably worth noting that it's not quite as in depth on the OS side as Microsoft's vulnerability scanning. That's probably a given, just because Microsoft created the OS itself, right? Risk scoring is prioritized into a list and provides CVE scores like many other vulnerability solutions, along with guidance on how to do remediations. And all of this is living under that same platform and same management console.
Okay, so this is then a screenshot of Microsoft's vulnerability dashboard. So another kind of dashboard here, and again, lots of information on the screen. Just to pick out a couple of areas, we can see quite an obvious exposure score there, so 56 of 100. This is a score where the lower the number, the better. So 56 is actually not great. That indicates that there's a fair number of vulnerabilities. Again, those could be because of operating system misconfiguration or applications that are missing certain updates. This then is the list version of the Microsoft dashboard. So you get a list of recommendations. These get automatically weighted by Microsoft and given a score. Now, some of these are related to protocols or browsers or operating systems or applications. It doesn't really matter. They all get scored in an equivalent kind of way. And the idea is that the item at the top of the list is the most dangerous. So if you are prioritizing the riskiest thing, you would try to resolve the thing at the top and work your way down. So again, SentinelOne have a similar kind of concept. This is the list of vulnerabilities present in applications. So again, we get a scored list. Again, the top one being the worst, the idea being you would individually try and resolve these particular problems. What I would say is that Microsoft gives you a bit more detail around how you should go and resolve the vulnerability. SentinelOne tells you that it exists, but Microsoft gives you some steps and actions you can take. So just on the detection side of things, and this is obviously one of the key parts of these products, in the Microsoft side, we have what's called the Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph. Some amazing stats on this. So in 2004, the FY, this is the financial year, not the calendar year, Microsoft synthesized 78 trillion signals per day. So 78 trillion individual data points per day were ingested into their intelligent security graph. And each of those data points is then used to improve the detection capability of all of Microsoft's security tools. Now, that volume of threat intelligence is the largest in the industry. And this is one of the big selling points of the Microsoft ecosystem, is that they simply have more data than any other vendors. And that is, a really hard thing to match. So Nick, I'll hand over to you on that one.
Yeah, so SentinelOne's kind of big selling point is that they use their behavioral AI engine to monitor the processes on a device at that kernel level. The AI is monitoring for suspicious processes that take place in real time and removes the requirement for constant device scanning. The AI engine is looking at what SentinelOne calls a storyline, basically a set of footprints that are contextualized to identify malicious acts in real time and automate the response. SentinelOne will also layer this with some additional protection in a more traditional sense by looking at the file hash and using reputation-based blocking that is all fueled by SentinelOne's continual threat intelligence, while not as vast as Microsoft's threat intelligence. Of course, SentinelOne allows for some more traditional detection rules, USB blocks and firewall rules to be blocked in the first instance, just to remove the reliance on hashes and AI detection engines. But putting that all together just allows SentinelOne to show that storyline of an incident and all the processes that took place and SentinelOne's decisions to protect. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. So this is a page, again, from Microsoft. So Microsoft have a threat intelligence component. Again, we're talking about a best-of-breed suite. It has a TI component built in, and this is one of those examples. So what we're seeing on screen here is that there is at the very top, you can see some numbers. So there's 104 known active ransomware campaigns at the time I took this screenshot. And the idea is that Microsoft has kind of like a knowledge base around what these particular threats are. So you can go and read about them, understand how they operate, understand what the mitigations might be. But most importantly, if your organization is actually actively being targeted by one of these campaigns now, it will present that to you and also highlight which devices or which users, which mailboxes and things like that are targeted. So there's a core kind of version of this available in a typical licensing, but if you want the fully fledged Defender TI, that is an extra cost. But there is a basic version available in the M365 licensing side of things. Probably worth mentioning that SentinelOne don't really have an equivalent view of that. Again, because they're a best of breed vendor, Microsoft is doing that best of suite thing. So just on the response capabilities, Defender has what they call a automated investigation and response, or AIR capability. And the idea is that when a particular series of events happens, depending on the configuration that you have, Defender can take an automatic action. So it could be that there is some suspicious user behavior. Defender will do an automatic investigation. It will look at what that user typically does on a day-to-day basis. What do they usually do on Friday at 3 p.m.? Are they typically accessing these particular servers in this particular way? If they're not, it may consider that behavior suspicious, and it could potentially then look at blocking that user and actually disabling their identity. On the device side, what it may decide to do is, if it sees a particular file that it doesn't like the look of, it may choose to proactively quarantine that file just in case. It will then investigate that file. If the file is believed to be non-malicious, then it may release that quarantine for you. There's a number of other kind of automated actions that can happen, but the core idea is, and this is something that Microsoft really encourages as part of a best practice, is that you should enable all of the automation, enable full investigation and full response actions, so that Defender can do some of the heavy lifting for you. Take some of that strain off your IT team and have the product do the heavy lifting. That's one of the big things they focus on. So there's a lot of kind of automation built into Defender to do those kind of things.
Right. So on the SentinelOne side, in terms of response capability, so as we mentioned before, SentinelOne uses that behavioral AI engine to detect the suspicious processes. That same AI engine will automatically make a decision to kill and quarantine or isolate a device. SentinelOne has a few great response capabilities. So SentinelOne can isolate a device and only allow communication between the S1 console and the infected endpoint. This is allowing time for manual intervention for a SOC team to investigate, but really it's there to try and stop the lateral movement of an infected device. And at this stage, you're probably wishing that the incident never happened in the first place. And that's when SentinelOne's rollback feature comes into play. And it's essentially like the incident never did happen. So SentinelOne takes shadow copies of a device and of files to allow you to roll back to an earlier version before the machine was infected. Once it's been quarantined and remediated, essentially.
Interesting around that rollback feature that SentinelOne have. The interesting part is that shadow copy capability actually uses part of the Windows operating system, but Microsoft don't have their own equivalent within Defender. You could do it using just Windows generally, but the SentinelOne have turned it into like an actual functionality in their EDR product, but Microsoft haven't, which is quite interesting, very strange in my view. So this is just a view of Microsoft's Advanced Hunting Portal. So I'm not going to go in great detail here, but KQL is the language that is used. You can ultimately query any of the telemetry captured in your Defender portal. This looks at historic information, it's not forward-looking. But the idea is, if you want to just validate, I've seen something that I'm questioning here, what you could do is write a bit of query language script and then pull back all the relevant information across all your devices and try to do some proactive kind of hunting of threats there. So quite a robust feature. SentinelOne do have something that's kind of equivalent, but it isn't quite as fully fledged as a Microsoft offering. It works in a similar kind of way. You're looking at particular IDs and information tags, and then you can look at that across your entire set of endpoints. But again, this is just an example, illustrative view. So just very briefly on compliance, Microsoft documents everything about compliance in their Trust Center. So you will get a copy of this deck, and there's a link in the deck to the Trust Center. Microsoft are compliant with all the regulations you would expect. So anything that you can come up with globally, they pretty much adhere to it, and they publicly document all of that in their Trust Center.
So, as you might expect on the SentinelOne side, again, obviously they adhere to many regulatory standards as shown in the slide. And much like Microsoft's Trust Center, SentinelOne's compliance, privacy, and best practices can be found on their website. The level of documentation is not quite as mature as what Microsoft has to offer.
Okay, so on the OS, we touched on that obviously Defender's built into modern Windows systems. It does support down level all the way down to Server 2012 R2. Defender is also supported on macOS, iOS, Linux, and Android. And over the last couple of years, Microsoft have actually made it one of their missions to achieve what they call feature parity. So this is where they're trying to have a like-for-like product, regardless of the operating system. Now, the truth is it's not quite there yet. The Defender product is always going to be best on a Windows system, particularly on a modern Windows system. But many of the core capabilities do exist on the mobile operating systems and on Linux and Mac. So it has gotten a lot better over the years, but it's not quite there just yet.
So SentinelOne make a point of supporting all the major operating systems and also ensuring that that full feature suite is provided across the various platforms. It's fair to say that some features may be better optimized on Windows, but this is something that both vendors, like Luke said, is constantly working on and improving. Support for mobile protection is also available within the same administration console and using the same AI detection engines. Again, it has that broad OS coverage with iOS, Android, and Chrome OS. SentinelOne also provides protection for cloud native environments and containerized workloads to make sure that these attack surfaces are covered. I did note that there's a question in the chat regarding servers, and it is included in the base level. You can deploy on servers and containerized workloads. Usually, you need protection for cloud, which is additional.
Okay, brilliant. So just moving on. So this is just again a screenshot of the device inventory. Now, just to anonymize our actual corporate devices, I've had to blank out some of the data, which, it's not the greatest device inventory when you can't see the device names, but in the real world, of course, you would be able to. And you can see in this list that you can get a view as to whether the device is actively being protected or whether there's an inactive device, which could be caused by a number of reasons. And it also gives you a view as to which devices are the most at risk. In the SentinelOne experience, we have a similar kind of view with similar kind of information, but you don't quite get the level of stats in terms of the known vulnerabilities because that's just available in a different part of their dashboard. In terms of integration, we know that Microsoft is a best of suite provider. So across all the Microsoft technology, whether it's security or not, it all integrates natively. I'm not really going to say much more than that, but essentially it's all built in, it naturally fits together, and there is no real configuration required to link all their technologies together.
Yeah, so I'll try and be quick on this section as well. So again, SentinelOne can be integrated into SIEM solution and SOAR platforms to enrich SOC services, and that's its primary focus. It also has integrations into security features similar to Microsoft's extended feature set, things like cloud protection, email security, identity protection, and firewall solutions. So leveraging things like Mimecast or Fortinet, SonicWall. But the aim overall is to create that more holistic view to display an end-to-end storyline, like I keep mentioning, for the SOC team, essentially, with these integrations.
Okay, brilliant. So vendor support, I suppose the brief side on the Microsoft bit is that if you have a unified support agreement, then Microsoft support is available to you. If you don't, then you'd have to go to an MSSP like ourselves or another Microsoft partner to get that support. Microsoft don't directly pick up the phone unless you've got an agreement with them, which are generally quite expensive.
So on the SentinelOne side, SentinelOne do pick up the phone themselves, and yeah, so we've worked with SentinelOne for several years, and the support has always been very comprehensive and very easy with that dedicated support portal, along with knowledge base help and the ability to raise support tickets directly. In more pressing scenarios, we can also call the 24/7 support team. SentinelOne do offer additional support on top of their base support, things like dedicated technical account managers and proactive health monitoring and reporting.
Brilliant. Okay, so just on costing, I'll go through this quickly because there's a few more things I want to cover before we wrap up. But for both product sets here, what we've got is the list prices. Now, these are basically the publicly available prices that are on the vendor's website. Now, what you actually will pay is going to be different. You might be able to negotiate a discount, or if you're going through a partner to purchase the licensing, it may actually get more expensive. So it's really hard for us to say what you'll pay. Obviously, if you do have questions about this level of detail, what we will offer is a free consultation to talk through this level of thing individually, because it will vary from business to business. The key things to understand is that on the Microsoft side, although we're talking about an endpoint security product, it's actually licensed per user, and that's because it's part of a wider suite of tools which cover many things. On the SentinelOne side, because it's a best of breed product, it's licensed based on the device. So you actually, it's difficult to compare them side by side because the price you pay is either for a user or a device, and that number could vary quite significantly. So I just wanted to highlight that at a high level, but we'll move on. So just to wrap up the session, I was going to talk in a bit more detail around XDR, but all I'll mention for now is that EDR is around endpoint detection and response. XDR is extended detection and response. Really, the Microsoft ecosystem, because it's a best of suite, it's actually an XDR product. It does the endpoint stuff as well as everything else on top. And there's a terminology difference, but without getting into the weeds, the way that we see it as trends in the industry is that organizations who are investing in security for the long term are actually looking beyond EDR, because that's only one component of the security world, and looking at XDR. And that's where one of the arguments for best of suite is strongest. That screenshot I'll just skip past. So here is just a list of some vendors that fall within these different categories. So we know that SentinelOne and their endpoint tool is best of breed. Now, what I've done here, and this is my own bias, I put this slide together, so apologies, Nick, but what, in my humble opinion, I would consider that Microsoft is a best of suite vendor, but also something a bit more than that. And the reason is that they offer their Defender XDR platform, but outside of that, you have the entire Azure ecosystem, so an entire cloud. You also have, of course, the Windows operating systems, which is an entire suite of things in and of itself. You've got their data protection platform, Purview. They've also got Sentinel, which is a SIEM and SOAR solution. So Microsoft offer basically a product in almost every major category, and there isn't really another vendor that can match that, which is why, again, I'm the Microsoft champion here. My bias is very clear. This is what I'd refer to as a Microsoft first approach, where you go, yeah, we trust Microsoft. They've got most of what we need, if not all of what we need. Let's invest in them because they can cover it all for us. It's not to say SentinelOne's bad by any means. It is a genuine best of breed product that is always been considered a high performing tool, but it's a different argument entirely to choose that level of tool over the Microsoft equivalent. So just in terms of what might be best for you, I'm just going to flash a few things on screen. Ultimately, if you need a specialist tool that is a niche player, it does something quite complex in an area that matters highly to you, then SentinelOne would be the choice. If you are a more typical environment, you just want a suite of technologies that can do more or less everything for you, and you want that simplicity in terms of cost management and relationship management with the vendor, then Microsoft might be the best option in your particular case. It will obviously vary from organization to organization. So without further ado, we'll move on to questions. And while we do that, I'll just bring up this slide. Again, we are offering a consultation. So if there's any questions based on this session or really anything else, you can reach out to myself, Nick, or Mark, or any of the other CyberOne folks on the call, and we'll get some time in with you. Whether you want to discuss these tools or something else, we'll make the time to do that. I'm just going to look at the questions. So Nick, if you want to help me out with some of these. So just looking at a few of them.
Yeah,
So yeah,
I'll answer one whilst you
go
read
on.
a few of them. So, I think we have already touched on it, but there's a question that says, can you please comment on SentinelOne ransomware rollback? I think we have touched on that. And essentially, it's that shadow copy that is being able to restore files back to their previous state, essentially. So it focuses on files rather than like the overall image, although again with the Microsoft feature set you can roll it back to an overall image of a device. So yeah, that's that one.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, so there's a question from Garen just around the capability on servers. So yeah, you're right, Garen, that for the Defender Wales, you do need a Defender for Servers license. So there's a separate cost there, and again, the licensing in this world is always very complicated. But we can help you try and understand that. What I would say at a basic level is you will pay for your Defender for Endpoint license. Then for every server that you need to be onboarded, there is a further cost purely for the servers. So there's a bit of a double whammy there. On the SentinelOne side, because their costing is done per device, the figures that you have, it doesn't matter what the device is, whether it's a user's laptop or a server, the cost is going to be the same. So there's some differences between the vendors there.
There's a question from Charles, and which product do you use at CyberOne? And actually, it kind of answers two questions at once. Is actually we use them both. So SentinelOne is kind of in a primary state, but also we use Defender as well, and leverage that full suite capability of Defender with the vulnerability scanning and so on. So yes, they can run. You can have both solutions, but one has to be in a primary state and one just has to be in an alerting state only. Otherwise, they will overlap and cause some issues.
Yeah, I can see Paolo asked a question exactly on that, didn't he, Nick? So, I mean, Nick's kind of answered it there, but yeah, you technically can have both products in place, but one of them will need to be the primary. And if you have SentinelOne as the primary, for example, Defender is still there, but it's in a passive mode. So you get some of the Defender features, such as vulnerability management and a few other things. But SentinelOne would be the primary EDR tool in our particular case. That's how we have things set up. There's also another question from Paolo again. So if a customer doesn't have any EDR and they've been hit by ransomware, what is our recommendation to investigate and respond to that? Yeah, so I mean, if you don't have an EDR in place and you've been hit by ransomware, you're going to be in trouble, to be honest with you. A more traditional security tool is probably not going to protect you properly from that. So if the attack has already happened, you're actually in a recovery phase in terms of incident response there, which is, a whole nother kettle of fish. But in terms of dealing with ransomware, both Defender and SentinelOne are fully capable of that. Both products would detect known ransomware. That is a guarantee. In terms of unknown ransomware, because they both have very clever detection engines, they would, instead of detecting the ransomware as a particular version of ransomware, they would detect based on the behavior. So if things start to get encrypted on a device, that's not normal. Both products would pick up on that pretty quickly. And what they would try to do, if you've got the automation functionalities enabled, is the two different products would try to prevent the spread. So they try to contain the threat. They try to quarantine the files responsible or the actual entire device potentially. And they would both be able to deal with the majority of ransomware instances. So just bringing up one of our last slides here. So Mark, our colleague, has put this in the chat, but we do a lot of events here at CyberOne. We try and share the knowledge as best as we can. If you've enjoyed listening to myself in particular, I will be in person at the Shard on the 30th of September. So I'll be talking around investment. How do you invest into security? A lot of businesses view security as a cost. I would argue it's actually an investment because, if you can prevent a data breach, that's going to save you money in the long run. So if you're interested in that kind of a topic, you can come and visit us when we present in the Shard, and you'll get to see myself in person. Unfortunately, Nick may or may not be there, but I'll see if I can drag him along with me. If you're unable to join us in person at the Shard, then we have a similar event running as a webinar on the 26th of September. That's the one in blue. That one, similar kind of content, but it's going to be condensed. The Shard event is a much longer event, but they discuss similar kind of topics. So if one or both of them is of interest, please register, and we'll help you with your investment challenges. But I think we've covered the questions there, Nick. So is there any closing remarks from yourself, or if anyone's got any final questions, feel free to drop those in the chat.
Yeah, I think I'm good from my side. Obviously, thanks for everybody's time. Yeah, I think it's been a good session.
Yep, brilliant. Okay, yeah, nothing more from me. As we said, we'll share the recording and the presentation of this out to everyone who's attended. So please, give it to your colleagues and look over it again yourself. And like I said, if you need any help, then please reach out to myself or Nick or any of the CyberOne team. And we'll call it a day. So thank you all for attending. We do really appreciate it. Hope you have a good rest of the week and enjoy your weekend.